Everyone. We're really excited to talk to you guys about this very interesting topic of how data science is disrupting marketing communications. My name is Dhaval. I'm the Director of Product Marketing for Cartesian Consulting, and I'll also be joined with my colleague and friend Tapan, who heads Innovation Labs for Cartesian Consulting. The presentation is going to be for about 40 minutes, and we're going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A. All right, so we're going to have 40 minutes of the presentation time, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. During the course of the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to post those questions on the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll take these questions up towards the end. Also, I would request you to collapse your GoToWebinar right-hand side panel onto the right, so that you have a full view of the screen. You can do that by pressing the yellow arrow icon on the top. Okay. So let me start with a really interesting question, right? If I were to show you these two ads, and if I were to ask you which of these ads are likely to perform better, what would your answer be? Well, I would kind of guess that your answer would be, you would need to test it, right? So, I mean, because it's really not that easy to really have a point of view on a creative, right? Because it's very subjective. It's really a combination of a lot of parameters: the visual, the call to action, the copy, and all of that. So it's not really a straightforward answer when you have to choose between different creative options. But what if I were to tell you that today we actually have an approach where you can actually predict open rates of your creatives even before you launch them, right? What if we knew that these creatives actually have an open rate of 2.3% and 3.4% even before these creatives go live, right? Wouldn't that be amazing? Because especially in today's environment where the scale of our campaigns and the nature of our acquisition exercises are very, very intense, we're really in a very high stakes environment, and it really makes a lot of sense to have a good understanding of what's going to work or what's not going to work even before we go live with it, so that we're able to take more effective decisions, isn't it? Now, you know what, guys, this is actually happening as we speak. There are ways and methodologies that help us predict open rates of creatives before we go live, and not just predict open rates or response rates of our creatives, but it also helps us get recommendations and suggestions that would help us improve our creatives to be able to get maximum response. And that's really the crux or the cornerstone of this conversation that we're going to have today, because we're going to look at different ways and methods and approaches that we could explore to be able to really bring data science into the art of creative. And with this as the context, let's just dive right into this conversation, where we'll take you through how we're approaching the marketing communications problem using data science. So if we have to really approach the marketing communication problem using data science, we need to probably take a step back and ask a really fundamental question, right? The question is the one that you're seeing on your screen right now. And the question really is, what is the goal of communication? Now, all of us would have an answer for this. And the answer really is, yes, it's response, right? We all know that. We all know that the goal of communication really is response. But while we know that the goal is response, when we see it from a data lens, or when we see it from a communication strategy lens, or when we see it from a consumer behavior lens, or when we see it from a creative lens, it's not that simple, because there are too many variables, there are too many unknowns, and it's not really that easy to be able to drive response in today's age and time, because the consumer is exposed to a lot of communication, right? With the digital revolution, the avenues of reaching out to the customer are multifold, and the access to the customer is solved to a large extent. But the question really is about how relevant is our engagement with our customer, and therefore response is not really an easy paradigm to address in today's age and time. So to address response, I think let's just look at response in a little more granularity, and to do that, we'll explore response at two levels. The first level is, Response is actually multi-layered, right? When we talk about response, we're really talking about a response funnel, right? You could have different labels here, but largely the process is you're going to have impressions or reach or view, depending on the kind of media and the ad format that you're working with, whether it is online, offline, whichever way. You'll have impressions, you'll have opens, you'll have click-throughs, you'll have leads and conversions. The key point being made here is there are going to be different levels, and we're going to have dropouts at each level. It's important to understand that data science will be able to manifest in different ways at different levels, and different levels will lend themselves differently to the use of data science for optimizing a given layer of response. So this is one important point to keep in consideration when we talk about response. The other important point to keep in consideration about response is response really means different things to different people in different contexts, right? For some people, it'll just be click on a link. For some people, it'll be visit a website or visit a landing page or download an app or walk into my store or register for my services or subscribe to my product, or even things like visiting a landing page and filling up a form, right? So depending on what response means to you, there will be a specific way of approaching it and addressing it using all available data science techniques. So these are the two important things to consider as far as response is concerned. And to be able to therefore address response more holistically, I think it's important to solve for response at a very, very, very macro level. And to solve for response, we really need to find a way to model response, right? I mean, there is a lot of insight sitting in our historical data. There's a lot of insight sitting in all the work that we've done so far. If there's a way to extract those insights and to kind of therefore use that understanding and use that learning to be able to therefore make predictions about how our creative is going to perform in the future, and also to generate suggestions and recommendations around how we could make our creative better. I think that's how we are going to be able to achieve, some level of control over all our subsequent creative activities. So to model response, we have to be cognitive of three key areas that fundamentally influence response, right? And these three things that you see on your screen right now, I mean, that's known territory, right? We're talking about target audience, we're talking about media, we're talking about creative. And these are the three fundamental pillars of response. I mean, there are more things, but these are really the key aspects, the key components that play a role in driving response. And like I said, it's known territory. We all know about these things. And if you think of it from a target audience and media perspective, I think the world is doing a lot of work in terms of making target audience selection, segmentation, identifying your segments, creating your segments, targeting the customers with the right message. All of that piece of target audience selection is kind of getting addressed to some extent with today's technologies and platforms and data science approaches. Also, the whole problem of media optimization or media allocation, that aspect is also getting addressed in interesting ways using data science today. So it's important to therefore just spend a little time here and understand what data science is really doing on the target audience and the media pieces as far as driving response is concerned. And maybe this is a good time to bring Tapan in, who will kind of give us some very interesting perspectives on what's currently being done in the target audience and the media space in the context of data science. Tapan, you would want to just
Okay.
come in
Yeah,
now?
thanks, Dhawan. So, yeah, when one is looking at marketing communication, there is ATL or mass media, and there is also targeted or what is referred to as BTL. So, there are these elements of target audience and media are actually common to both, but play differently in both channels. So, I'm going to try to address them separately. When one is talking about mass media, the target audience and media selection really drives the following question: that how do I allocate my marketing budget to achieve reach frequency, which will in turn help me with my marketing KPI, which could be leads or new acquisitions or something of that sort. Now, this is a problem that we have been solving for a while using a set of specific techniques called marketing mix modeling. Again, these models have been around for a while, but in the last 2 3 years, they have gotten so much better for two or three different reasons. One is the granularity at which the data is available has improved, and the speed with which data is available is, there's very little latency. So earlier, what used to happen was, if you are looking at a marketing plan for a quarter, for you to actually gather data, which can then be fed into a model, would take 2 months or 2.5 months. Uh, so by the time the results of the model have to be used, they're actually largely irrelevant. Now this has changed because there have been technologies to automatically capture data, and also on the modeling side, we have. In the world there are very sophisticated techniques available which use methodologies like genetic algorithms to efficiently and accurately estimate these complicated things like the saturation rates, the uh, the S curve as it is called. These can be very efficiently and accurately estimated, and the modeling time frame is actually reduced from 6 months to maybe 4 to 6 weeks for the first build, and thereafter a recalibration takes about a week. So you can actually take these decisions at a time using data and data science, and they can actually make meaningful difference. So that's on the mass media side. On the targeted side, uh, there are these classic direct marketing principles of LOCTR: list, offer, creative, response, timing. Out of these, list is the one that really leads to propensity modeling and response modeling. Now, again, these have been around for a while, but gone are the days of handcrafted logistic regression model built by an artisanal data scientist. What we have in place of that are uh, ML AI pipelines which help you build n number of models in a very short time. Some of these models, depending on how you are trying to approach the problem, can also be what is called self-healing, which means that the model, in the earlier days, a model would be built once and then it would run for years and it would not be recalibrated until somebody noticed that something was going wrong with it. Now, today, the models do that themselves. So, on the list part, these are some of the recent advancements. On the response part, we'll come to that. But on offer and timing, again, there are two techniques which are coming to play. On offer is essentially a product recommendation. Now, recommender systems have been around in a meaningful way for the last 20 years. But in the last few years, again, there have been advancements made, and not only of online e-commerce sites, but also in targeted communication, recommender algorithms are being used to also drive in-store behavior. So that's on the product side, product or offer side. On the timing side, there are governance mechanisms. Because everybody is always trying to reach out to the customer, it is also a meaningful question to ask yourself is, when should I actually shut up? When should I stop communicating with a customer, give him a breather, let him, then maybe I can communicate with him in a while. Now, this sounds like a heuristic, sounds like something that is being done based on gut feeling, but it need not be that way. There can be models built which will help you with governance, and these can also be fine tuned to get individual level governance principles. So, on LOCTR, these are the two or three things which are coming up, which are helping you with these elements. The common element which we have looked at in mass media and in targeted media is C, which is the creative. And while all the other aspects are interesting, we are going to focus on creative today. And the reason we are focusing on creative, Dhaval, can you go into that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really interesting because I think what Tapan is trying to get at is the fact that creative or content has always been seen to belong to the realm of copywriting and artworking and essentially the creative domain, right? So content has largely been seen as an outcome of a creative process, which is fine. But increasingly, what's happening is data science is opening up a completely new avenue to see creative in a whole new light because in addition to content being driven by creative, data science could actually also be a very important contributor in driving content. And that's
Sorry
really,
to jump in
yeah,
there, Dhaval.
sure,
This was
Tapan, go
also
ahead.
not possible earlier because
Yeah.
creative was things like text, images, videos. So data, it was not structured data. and just could not be dealt with in a meaningful way. Now, with the new advent of things like convolutional neural networks, we can actually process these things as a meaningful source of data. So, yeah, go on. Sorry, I just couldn't
Sure,
stop
fantastic.
jumping in there.
No, that was quite interesting, Tapan. So the whole point is, yes, I mean, long story short, creative has long been seen, in a conventional light in the creative world, as in the content has been seen in the creative world, whereas we've been open to exploring data science on the target audience and the media side. But now this opportunity is really opening up, and there are interesting ways of bringing data science into content creation, into the creative realm as well, and that's something that we would really want to explore with some more detail in the subsequent conversation. So when we talk about creative, it's the untapped space. It's where there is phenomenal potential for data science to create impact and to create value, more from a driving response perspective. So if that's what we're really interested in, let's try and understand creative with a little more precision. So when we say creative, we all understand that we're talking about words, images, audio, sounds, and video, right? These are your, different forms that creative usually ends up manifesting in. So if we're really talking about banners or television commercials or outdoor hoardings or text ads or print ads or even banner ads, we're really talking about the use of rich media. Now, like Tapan was saying, the whole point of creative not lending itself to data science is really stemming from the fact that unless we are able to move these elements of words, images, audio, sounds, video, uh, move these things from the creative realm into the data realm, it's not going to be possible to be able to apply data science to it. And that's where a really interesting concept of feature engineering, makes its impact, because feature engineering is a really interesting approach of data science, which allows us to convert all of these interesting creative formats into what we call as features. Now that's really interesting because once you move the creative components of words, images, audio, etc., from the creative realm into the features realm, they become more amenable to further application of data science techniques, and therefore further application in very interesting use cases. And if you have to draw a parallel, this is very similar to a transducer, right? In the electricity and in the electrical and the electronics world, right? A transducer essentially converts physical signals into electrical signals, and that's when it lends itself. The electric signals therefore lend themselves better to further processing and further interesting applications. So therefore, feature engineering is a really cool concept that allows us to move our creative into the features realm. And when we talk about features, what we're essentially referring to are things like personalization, offer, emotions, urgency, gratification, all of those things. And these are your key building blocks for leveraging all the available data science to create meaningful predictions and recommendations around driving open rates and response rates to your communication. And of course, feature engineering learns and trains on historical data. So it is kind of a good opportunity or a good avenue for, like I said, converting creative into the data realm, and therefore lending itself better to subsequent processing. So once we've done feature engineering and converted creative into features, we also do an interesting thing, which is analyze the impact of features on response rates. Okay, because when we say, let's say you're using personalization, you're using an emotion, you're using an offer or an urgency, how much is that component really contributing to your eventual response rate? And that's something that comes as an output of the feature engineering process. Now, this output, which is the set of features and the impact of those features on response rates, then gets fed into a machine learning algorithm, right? Because the machine learning algorithm would be able to make sense of these features and their consequential impact on response rates, to be able to then predict open rates or response rate for your communication. So for example, if we have a banner ad, let's say, we take it through the feature engineering process. The feature engineering will split the banner ad into the set of features that are embedded in the ad, and it will also give us the impact that those features have on the overall response. this becomes an input into the machine learning process, which will eventually tell you that this creative or this particular image is likely to have a response rate of so much. And it will also give us suggestions via a simulation exercise to actually improve the creative. So that's really the big idea, right? I mean, we have creative, we break it down into features, we understand the impact of each of these features on response rates, we try and predict the response rate basis this understanding, and therefore, also offer suggestions to improve the response rate. All right. So that's one of the core aspects of feature engineering. Now, if feature engineering is really important and is the core of this entire process, it might be interesting to spend a little bit of time on understanding feature engineering in a little bit of detail. So when we say feature engineering, we're really referring to two key components. And the two key components of feature engineering are feature extraction and covariates creation. And the reason why these two things are important is because feature extraction essentially allows you to extract features from the creative, and covariates creation essentially allows you to understand the impact of these features on response rates. For example, let's look at an image, because we said there are different inputs, right? So images is one of the things that we could look at. So let's say we put an image through a feature engineering process. What we see this banner ad. We run feature engineering on it, which is feature extraction as the first component of feature engineering, and it breaks it down into these features. So we now know a lot more about this image than what we would have otherwise known. And therefore, these features then lend themselves to covariates creation. So we will then know what impact would the offer, or would a person sitting on a table, or would a kitchen shot, or would a product shot have on an overall response rate. Also simple things like, I mean, there are established paradigms here, like people looking into the camera
Okay,
in a
Dhaval,
in
just
a
jumping in
image.
here,
Yeah, sure.
because this,
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the way we have articulated this image here and the various features, it may
Yeah,
seem like it's a very simple task. It's actually
yeah,
not simple at all.
yeah,
This is a very difficult task to get these kinds of features from an image. In most cases, you have to do a bit of handcrafting and machine learning to be able to get these kinds of features. So it's the fact that we have it here and tagged so well is quite
yeah.
astonishing.
Yeah,
So yeah,
exactly.
please
So
continue.
yeah, sure. So the key point here is, if we're able to decipher features from the image, and if we're able to do the right covariates creation, we then have the data in a form where we can lend itself to a lot more sophisticated processing, and therefore, we end up making predictions about response rates, and the recommendations around how to actually improve it. So I think what we'll do is, Tapan, it'll now be a good time to just understand feature engineering, feature extraction, covariates creation in a little more detail, looking at it from a machine learning, from a data science lens, in terms of what kind of techniques do we really use to really do these things, right?
Sure, I'll take a stab at explaining a bit without going too technical and zoning everyone
Sure.
out. So
Sure. No, that'll be great.
let's look at two kinds of media. One is text, the other is image, and I'll speak a little bit about both. I'll say some challenges which are uniquely involved in both. So let's first look at text. Now, text, when I'm thinking of text, it could be the way an offer is worded in an advertisement. It could be the subject line of an email. It could be an SMS. It could be a notification. It could be a social media post. It could be any text which is actually, the way we are looking at it, it is an ordered set of features. Now, features are things like what you mentioned earlier, things like gratification, urgency, offer, personalization, etc. Now, to get that text and parse it into this ordered set of features, there are two ways in which one can do this. One is actually a bit of feature tagging, which is done, which is I mean manually done or handcrafted, and then building models for probabilistic feature inclusion. So that's when I'm saying that okay, this set of words used in these subject lines or these notifications is actually referring to gratification. I'm labeling certain data Then I'm building models based on the labeled data, and then I'm in an ongoing basis. I don't have to actually go on labeling data, but I have some labeled data based on which the labeled data is comprised of features. So there is a bit of handcrafting involved here, and that turns out to be very useful as we'll see later. But this label data is first used. Then you have things like regular expressions, which are actually going to help you to uh, parse subject lines or notifications to find things like what you have labeled. Then you have these two core NLP algorithms like word to vec and glove. These are what I mean. Here I am not actually handcrafting anything. I have labeled data. Now I am parsing that data through an algorithm like word to vec. Now it is converting that into something, some digits, and there will be some patterns in it because word to vec essentially it is creating a vector for words, and then it is combining those vectors and it is recreating the subject line or the notification text. And these algorithms, I mean, this is the input training data. It is then a model is built on the labeled data, and so for subsequent uh, the text that comes my way, I can actually have probabilistic features included, and I can build a model based on that. So much for text, which is actually the simpler of the two. In images, it's much more complex. Uh, so Dhawal, the kind of labels that you had shown in the earlier image, they are virtually impossible to get using a pure ML approach. Okay, they have to be at least partially handcrafted. Now, in when one is looking at images, convolutional neural network, where fondly referred to as CNN, is the standard technique which is used to convert an image into data which can be further processed. Uh, in an image, to get feature, so in that image that you had shown, you had a feature called kitchen. Now a feature of that nature is very difficult to get because a, there has to be enough training data for kitchens, and b, for me to consider kitchen as a feature, it has to be meaningful for what I am trying to solve. If that does not happen, then that will lead to a humongous amount of features which are very sparse. So, while you can use techniques like CNN to actually parse images and extract features from them, a bit of labeling and handcrafting is also something which is commonly done. Um, Now, essentially what one is doing here is, be it a line of text or an image, and the same can also apply for other media. We are essentially saying that a creative is an ordered set of features, and one is doing a mapping of features for that creative, and that one is saying that this set of features is this creative. So this is the feature extraction part. Okay, can we go on to COVID? Yeah, okay. So now, what we are doing here is that I have done the feature extraction. So now my creative is no longer that image or that line of text. Now it is a set of features, some of which are included in this, and features have a position. It may be top left corner in the image, or it may be the fifth word in the notification text. So I have these features, and I have my historical data where I know the response rates. It could be a click through rate or it could be an open rate, and I have this set of independent variables. So for those of you who have done these things in the past, you know what we are now going to do. We are trying to look for relationships between these features and the target variable, and hence we will do some transformations, and we'll create some meaningful, we'll try to create some covariates which will then be fed into a machine learning model to be able to accurately predict the response rate, which is either a CTR or an open rate. So, one common way in which we use these features are in the form of scores. So, historically, when these features have been used, how has the impact been? And there are a few ways in which one can represent that so that it has a predictive value. So this is really the part where I'm creating, I mean, I have extracted features from the creative. Now I have transformed them in a way that is meaningful for the problem that I'm trying to solve, which is to predict the CTR or the open rate. Okay, now comes the third part, which is building of the predictive model using a bunch of techniques. Now here, uh, there are again, I mean, there is no easy solution here. There are two ways in which one approaches this. One is to approach it as a point prediction, which is I'm here using techniques like random forest or XGBoost or support vector machine to say to accurately try to predict the CTR or the open rate. Is it 4.7%? It is three. Is it 3.2%? This is one way in which one can approach this. Again, uh, there is a pipeline comprised of various ML techniques which which are used to get the best possible model in a given situation. And this is the rigor is actually quite maddening of this whole process, because unfortunately and also fortunately for data scientists like us, no one method applies. There's no free lunch. There's no one method which always outperforms the others. So one has to actually go through the rigor of trying out different methods. Even when one has invested a lot of time in feature extraction and engineering, one still has to go through this rigor, and then one comes up with a given model which is uh, able to also explain and predict very well. Now this is when I'm trying to do a point prediction. There are situations when I'm not able to do a point prediction because of insufficiency of data. We'll probably look at this later in detail, but let me just mention this in the passing, that in such situations what one tries to do is, this is most typically in the case of a cold start problem. When I have too little data points, then one way in which one approaches cold start problems is by ranking across the alternatives. So if I have, say, 20 images with CTRs and that's all the data that I have, then what I would do is I would compare the new image with those 20 images and see where it fits, and accordingly I will make an estimate for that image CTR. So that's not really a point estimate, that's more a range, but that's as good an estimate as I can do in because of insufficiency of data. Okay. Now, uh, so what we have done so far is we have looked at representing creative as a set of features. We have created covariates. We have built a model. We have tried to predict what the CTR or the open rate is. uh, there are a bunch of techniques that one is using for that, but this still doesn't give you any recommendations. Now if you are going the pure AI route where you are not handcrafting certain features, you are actually not going to get any recommendations. You will just get a prediction, and then you can try alternatives, and then you can get a new recommendation. Then you can get a new prediction. You will have to actually go through this iterative process to actually improve your response rates. If you have handcrafted certain features and if you have label data available, and if you also have the feature scores available, like we said earlier, then one can actually use those feature scores uh, to make recommendations for improving the response rates. Here, what one does is there are two layers of this. One is a simulation. Now, simulation will essentially do things like, in case of text, there is natural language generation, which means that it will essentially compose alternative notification texts. So these texts will make sense in the language, and they will be slightly different expressions of what you are trying to say. Now, that's the simulation part. Now, all of these simulations will then be scored against the model that you have built and taken so much time to build. You will get a predicted open rate against each of those alternatives, and then based on those predicted open rates and your candidate uh, creative, it can make certain recommendations for features that you should include or exclude, or in some cases it can just suggest an alternative creative, easier done in text than in image. So we have taken uh, this from prediction to the recommendation realm, where one is actually giving you alternative suggestions, and in some cases, and this problem is more tractable in case of text, where an alternative text can also be recommended if the model is using that you're using in natural language generation. Uh, so yeah, with that, I mean, I think this I would like to pass it back to you, Dhaval.
Yeah, all right. Cool, Tapan. I think this is pretty insightful. What we'll do now is, so essentially, Tapan took us through the actual science that comes into play to be able to, drive this whole approach of converting creatives into features into components that help us use analytical tools for recommendation and suggestions. So now what we're going to do is, you know, this entire flow, this entire logic, we've attempted to apply it in a real world scenario. All right. And we're doing it for only the text component. So like we said, different components of creative are really words and, sounds and video and images and all of that. But for words in particular, we've gone the distance in terms of applying all of what we're talking about right now. So we have a very interesting use case, which we want to just quickly share with you guys in the next couple of minutes. So what we're trying to do in the word space is we're trying to solve for creatives that involve text, which means we're trying to solve for emails, we're trying to solve for SMSs, we're trying to solve for notifications. And the problem that we're solving here is how do we create our SMS content, or how do we create our email subject lines, or how do we create our notifications content in a way that we're able to get maximum response rates. In case of email, we're really talking about the response rates essentially manifests in the form of an open rate, because that's your first level of response and that's where your maximum dropouts happen. So if we're able to address the open rate problem for email, it kind of solves for response rates for email communication. So how do we do that? What we're doing is essentially the same flow. We're just using words. We're doing feature engineering. We're breaking it into features, feeding it to machine learning, predicting response rates, and giving you suggestions. In the context of email, the subject line, which is your input, which is your creative, which is what we're looking at optimizing, is seen as a ordered set of features. So for example, this is your subject line: hello Rahul, get 20% off on your next purchase up to rupees 5,000 only this week, and then there's a smiley. For that subject line, what we can really do is we can really try and interpret it from a features perspective. So hello Rahul is a personalization feature. 20% off is your offer. You have a condition there. You have an urgency element, and you also have a happiness emotion aspect manifesting in the form of a smiley. So once we've broken it down into these features, we're then in a position to be able to do feature engineering, to be able to feed that into a machine learning process, and to be able to predict open rates. And all of this, of course, happens in the context of the objective, the product, the campaign type, the target audience, the timing that is associated with this particular creative subject line that we're looking at. So what really happens once we break down the subject line into features, we're able to predict open rates. So this takes the form of a product that we've created to help you optimize your email subject lines. It's called Kite. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm just going to show you one screen. Here's where you set up the context. Like I said, these recommendations and predictions for subject lines are sensitive to the context that that subject line is really being used in. So once we set the context, we are then able to put in the subject line and get a predicted open rate for that subject line. I mean, that's really amazing, isn't it? Because you haven't yet run the campaign, right? You've just created your subject line, and the solution actually tells you what your open rate is going to be. And we've got an accuracy of about 95% and more on this kind of an output. Now that's really fascinating because you don't need to A/B test, or maybe you can A/B test with a little more better understanding of your creative, but you're also able to therefore improve your subject line using all the suggestions that you're getting to be able to then arrive at the most optimum subject line that's going to give you the best open rate. And that's phenomenal because you're able to do all of this without actually running a campaign, and therefore it really makes your subject line decision a lot more effective. We've seen this in various scenarios for banks, for apparels, for OTT and online streaming platforms, for e-commerce, etc. A couple of things I think which Tapan also briefly touched upon are we've run into a few areas which ended up being constraints to actual implementation in these scenarios, because you don't always have the kind of historical data that you would really need to be able to make intelligent predictions and recommendations. And that's where we've encountered a few constraints, and we would want to just spend 2 minutes in understanding what these constraints really have been, because one of the most popular constraints is really the paucity of data, right? I mean, we never have enough historical data to be able to model response, to be able to accurately predict your open rates and get suggestions. That's what we call the cold start problem. And that's not a problem unique to text data. That's a problem that's pertinent across all different formats of creatives, whether it is videos, whether it is text, whether it is images, soundtracks, all of those things. So in a scenario where we have less data, how do we try and still make the most of it and move forward? So what we've done there is, I'll just give you a quick peek into what we really did when we encountered a cold start problem for one of our with one of our clients. We really said, look, I mean, if we are in this cold start scenario, we don't have enough data, how do we still make recommendations and predict open rates? So we evaluated various techniques. We looked at random forest, we looked at neural networks, but these two techniques obviously need a lot of data to become effective. And then we evaluated what we call as classifier models, and it turned out that classifier models was the answer to this question, because classifier models allow us to still make reasonably acceptable recommendations and predictions even when you have less data volume. So that's where classifier models kind of came in and helped us tide over the cold start problem, and we were able to still deliver significant value in terms of the open rate predictions and the recommendations that we ended up generating. So cold start really talks about lack of volume of data. The other dimension of this problem is really, yeah, so that was that little animation that tells you that that's how we dealt with the cold start problem. Moving on to the other aspect of the cold start problem, which is the range lock problem. So cold start essentially talks about the problem with less data volume, whereas range lock essentially talks about the problem with lack of variety in data. Because lack of variety in data is an equally important constraint, because it therefore constraints our understanding of the prediction and the recommendations that we would give to a given client. Because usually a client would say, look, historically I've been getting response rates in the range of 5 to 7%. Now all my historical data will still allow you to generate insights which are constrained in this range, which is a 5 to 7% open rate range. So how do we break out of this 5 to 7% range into the realm of maybe a 14 to 16% range, right? Now this requires a little bit of outside of like out of the box thinking and breaking out that range, and looking at alt content or looking at external data sources, because then one is able to break free from the range problem which is arising out of not having enough variety in your data, to be able to then move out and into higher response rate ranges. So that's another constraint that one is usually faced with when you're talking about leveraging historical data for making your predictions and your recommendations effective. So, all right. So, what does this all mean? I mean, where are we really headed, right? I mean, what we're trying to say is, basis all of this, there are a few considerations that all of us should ideally really think of, right? And this webinar was designed as a very first level basic overview of this topic. Maybe we'll do more webinars in the future that will give us detailed understanding of each of these areas in specific use cases and in specific client scenarios. But here, it's important for us to take away a few important things. We're saying it's very important to understand if we're tagging our creatives well enough, right? Because oftentimes we do a lot of creative work, but it's not tagged well. So we don't really know what is constituting our creative and how can we make it more amenable to data science. Because one of the things that we spoke about is heuristics also kind of play a role in driving your understanding of your creatives, and therefore tagging creatives is a really important thing to do. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we really tagging all our creators well enough? Also, the second important question is, do we really have data? Because oftentimes we get fascinated by these really cool data science solutions, and we would want to really use them and leverage them. But we don't really have the data rigor or the data discipline to be able to make the necessary data available for these techniques, right? I mean, the techniques are going to be as strong as the data that goes inside it, right? And if one has to say that. But the whole idea is, if we bring in this data discipline, if we capture data, if we track data, if we're able to retrieve data, then we're in a much better position to leverage data science. Because we've seen in a couple of clients where people are doing a lot of notifications, maybe about 100 200 notifications a day, but it's really not easy for them to archive these notifications and to fetch this data for making use of it. So that's an important question that we should really look at answering. And one of the most important things that we should take away from this is this whole paradigm of creative driving content. It needs a little bit of rethinking, right? Creative, of course, is a very important driver of content, and it will be, but we also need to be very aware of the fact that data plays a very important role in driving content as well, and we got to look at the best of both the worlds to be able to get optimum response rates and get optimum consumer behavior in response to our communication, because that's really what we're solving for, isn't it? So we have to do this. And the last thing we should do is we should benefit from transfer learning, because we're in 2018, collaboration, ecosystem thinking, that's really the name of the game, because we will never have enough data to be able to use all the sophistication that data science offers. So we will have to collaborate, we will have to come together, we'll have to learn from each other's best practices, we'll have to build scenarios where we're able to leverage the entire data ecosystem across verticals, across clients, without really infiltrating into the PII space, where we still don't get into, we appreciate and respect the sensitivity of PII, but with that constraint, whatever it is that we can do in the form of collaboration, it's really going to help all of us, push the boundaries of what's really possible in terms of data science. And we need to do these things because it's becoming possible for data science driven programs to actually create ad copies, create banners, create emails, create push notifications, and a lot of other ad formats which are designed to deliver maximum response. And if we have to get there, we have to really fix these 3-4 things that we really spoke about in terms of making ourselves available to this kind of an opportunity, because this really is the real disruption of marketing communication. Because getting the science right and getting the art right is really the key to driving response. And if we're able to do this, that's when we would have really leveraged data science to its potential in terms of creating the kind of impact on response, creating the kind of impact on performance, so that we're able to make the most of all the data science that's out there to make our marketing communication effective. And it's actually beginning to happen. I mean, this isn't some cool stuff that we can talk about. These are things that are hitting the ground. These are things that are happening as we speak, and these are things that a lot of people across the planet are beginning to take a serious shot at. These are things that people are beginning to start implementing, so that they're able to drive more value from their data, from their creative approaches, and therefore get the kind of impact they want on their response rates. So this entire thing of using data to drive creative is beginning to happen. And if we were to look at the two ads that we started this conversation with, right? We said we've got these two options. Which one do we choose? And if data science tells us that one is going to give you a 2.3% versus the other that's going to give you a 3.4% response, it becomes easier for us to choose. But like I said, we can actually go a step further. And today, data science can not just tell you the predicted open rates or suggestions to improve the creative, it can actually create a creative option for you by leveraging all of the techniques and approaches that we just spoke about, to actually then give you a third option which has learned from all of what you've done, and which is the one that actually would give you the highest response, right? And this is actually beginning to happen. And once we get to this point, we'll really be able to unlock a lot more potential, a lot more value in our marketing communications and in our consumer interactions and in our overall, business from a impact generation perspective. So that's really the story. I mean, all of these things are out there. We've got to align. We've got to really make the most of what we have to be able to leverage data science to its fullest potential. And the question that we should really be asking us or asking ourselves is, are we really ready? With that, I would like to really thank all of you for joining us for this webinar, and we were really, happy to have you all here. And what we'll now do is we'll take a couple of questions. I think we've been getting a lot of questions across the timeline on this presentation. So we'll use the remaining 10-15 minutes to quickly answer questions that we've received during the course of this presentation. Aniket, you want to? All right, Tapan, we have one question which says, why do we use a classifier model to solve the cold start problem? You want to just share a quick perspective on that?
Yeah, okay. So, sure. So, see, point prediction is a much more difficult problem than a classification problem. Now, what one is trying to do in the classification way, I mean, the classification is one way and ranking is another way. What I described earlier was ranking, that we look at the historical creatives and we see whether the new candidate will do better than each of those alternatives, and then depending on where it fits, we make an estimate. So the ranking is one way. Classification essentially says that okay, even if I'm not able to solve that problem, there is even a simple problem that maybe I can solve, which is to say, will so let me look at the distribution of the historical CTRs and say that okay, is it going to be between in range A? Is it going to be between range A, like is it going to be between 0 to 2%? Is it going to be between 2 to 4%? Now these ranges can't be too wide, otherwise it ceases to be meaningful. But if one is not able to do a point prediction well, if one is not able to do a ranking well because of unavailability of data or lack of actually a systematic pattern in the data, in the limited data available, then classification can be a starting point, because it's a much easier problem to solve than the other problems.
All right. Okay, great. The
So,
other
and I mean,
question that,
it takes us
yeah,
somewhere.
yeah.
It takes us somewhere. It doesn't entirely leave us guessing. It is not as satisfying as a point prediction, but it takes us, helps us make some progress.
Oh, okay, great. So the other question that we have is, you know, how much time does it usually take to improve response rates?
Okay. Okay, that's like all good questions. There is no easy answer to that. Uh, let's think about what it takes to really improve response rate. What it takes is two, three things. One is the discipline of actually looking at what one has done historically, uh, and making systematic changes in that, which involves a bit of experimentation. Okay, there also has to be enough quantity that you are doing in the, I mean, it has to be a meaningful channel of communication for you. You have to be doing it often enough so that you can actually try out the variations, and that is how you can actually break from a range that you are stuck in. So um, it uh, so the bad creatives, weeding them out is much easier, and you, for you to reach a particular level, the first level of improvement is usually much easier. It takes about 2 3 months of this rigorous practice of making sure I'm not sending any bad one. And it also involves that your other elements, which we are not discussing in detail in this webinar, like your list, your product, all of timing, all of those are fixed. This alone is not going to improve your response rate, but having fixed all of those, this is the additional lever that you can use to improve your response rate. So, but at the very least, it takes 2 to 3 months if you are doing these things rigorously and in a consistent way.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Another question which is slightly related to the earlier one, and it's essentially talking about this. For creatives such as images, do we model it for difference in response by medium? That is, for example, an image in social media may have a very different response from the same image being used in email, or if the same image is being used in a banner on a website.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So this is similar to when we you showed the demo screen where you had a context. So what is, in case of an image, social media or banner ad, is setting the context. Now, in case of an image, I mean, there are basic features and there are visual features. So what medium are you displaying this image on? How many impressions are you actually giving? These are part of basic features. So yes, it will have to be dealt with differently. The feature extraction may still be the same, but the CTR is going to be different depending on the context.
Okay, cool. The other question is the problem of improving?
Also,
Yeah,
taking
sure.
that one step further, a
Hmm.
recommendation for one context may not actually work for another context. So context is absolutely essential, more so in the case of images.
Yeah, and I think I'll just quickly add to that. So this whole point that Tapan is making, right? If you think about marketing, campaigns, you're really talking about this. phrase that we use internally called LOCTR, right? Which is Lord of the Rings with the C in the middle. The point is, if LOCTR really is about list, about offer, about uh, communication, about timing, about response mechanisms, right? So there are all of these components that are playing a role in driving response in some way or the other. What we are delving into today is really the creative part, and that's because a lot of these other things are being addressed in some way. All right, so the list part, or the so like Tapan was talking about, you've got propensity models, you've got recommender systems which handle the the proposition or the offer part. So the list, the offer are areas that have been addressed with some level of sophistication, but it's really the creative part which isn't. But yes, in combination, these things kind of work together. So if we're only solving for creative and not solving for other things, it's obviously not going to add up, because it all needs to kind of, like I said, work together. So that's the whole point. But this webinar essentially was focusing on the creative component. We'll also have more conversations going forward where we'll talk about other aspects in a little more detail and see how they play a role as well. Okay, there's one. We just have time for one last question. I think there are a lot of them that I can see here. What I can tell you guys is, whoever, whichever question is not answered right now, guys, feel free to just drop us an email with that question. In fact, we already have your names and your questions right here. So we'll send out individual emails to you with specific responses. But if you have a question right now, or if you have a question later on, feel free to reach us on our email IDs. You have the organizer email ID with you, so you can actually send questions to Aniket, and we'll internally take it up and respond to you. So even if you don't have a question right now and you think of something else later on, feel free to reach out. But I'll just take this last question before we close, because I think that's all that we have time for. So the question is the problem of improving CTR, or click-through rate as we call it, different from the problem of solving for open rates? Well, the answer actually lies in this whole, point that we made in the beginning, right, about granularity of response. So response actually has various levels, right, from your impressions or views or reach, down to your open rates, down to your click-through rates, down to your conversion rates. So if you have to visualize the funnel in the context of an email, let's say, if you're shooting out a marketing email to a customer, the fact that the customer sees that email in their inbox is a view, right? And to get that view to happen, you also have to work on some of these other hygiene factors, like you have to whitelist your domain, you have to not be seen as spam by Google, and various other things. So even to earn a view is really a important first step. But once the customer sees your email in their inbox, which is which is the first point of contact, the next step in that journey is really to open that email, right, which is what manifests in the form of open rates. And what we've seen across businesses is, this is the place where maximum dropouts happen, right? Once your email is in the customer's inbox, and that's really because we spoke about this in the beginning, where we're saying that today the customer is exposed to a lot of communication, because access to customer has become really easy for brands. So you're getting a ton of email. To get your brand email opened by your customer is really a challenge, and that's why people struggle with low open rates, because we've seen across industry verticals, open rates range right from 1 to 2% to about 25%, and depending on what kind of science you're applying, or what kind of approaches you're applying, you could be anywhere in the middle. So the maximum dropouts happen at your open rate level, and then your downstream processes. So once I open your email, I have a call to action, I click on that call to action, that's your click-through rate. And then I reach your landing page, I read the stuff that you put up on the landing page, your proposition, I choose to fill up a form on your landing page, and that's when I become a lead. So this whole thing, from view to open rate to click-through rate to conversion rate, right, is all sensitive to different data science approaches. But the area where you can make maximum impact is really the open rate, for two reasons. One is because you're losing a lot of customers there. That's your top of the funnel. Your 2 to 20% is like really kind of narrowing your funnel down in a big way. So if you're able to address the top of the funnel well enough, you would really have created a wider funnel, and therefore you would have really allowed a lot of people to enter your response funnel, which would have then impacted your downstream rates in terms of CTRs and conversion rates in a constructive manner. So there are different techniques that need to be applied, different approaches from a data science perspective that need to be applied to solve for each of these things differentially, because like I said, they lend themselves differentially to the use of different kind of data science techniques, and that therefore you'll have to take a different approach to solve for open rates, and you'll have to take a different approach to solve for CTRs, and you'll have to take a different approach to solve for conversion rates, because of various implications that your offer, your proposition, your communication has on the customer at these different touch points, and also based on the kind of impact data science can make on each of these different states of response for our for your customers. So yes, I mean, while data science can solve for all of these things, you'll have to be sensitive to the level of response and the proposition and the overall scenario that you're communicating to the customer in, and therefore use the right methodology or the approach to be able to solve for the problem that you're trying to solve for, whether it is a click-through rate problem or an open rate problem.
I
So
mean,
that's where
CTR
we
is
will.
actually much more a problem than open rate.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it needs to
Yeah.
be
So
dealt with very
yeah,
differently.
sure, absolutely. So you'll have to, use the right approach for the right problem, and that's how we kind of go about it. So that's where we would, like to thank all of you for joining us on this webinar. We're really, excited with the kind of response we got for this. We really look forward to doing more such interesting webinars and conversations in the future around this very fascinating topic of data science, and how it is impacting business in various interesting ways. So stay tuned. We'll reach out to you guys for more such interesting conversations going forward. Thank you everyone once again for joining us, and we're really happy that all of us could join us on this webinar. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.